We are the Brady girls. We are the Brady girls. We know our manners. We spend our tanners. We are expected.
My name now is Judith Usiskin, date of birth 14/11/33, born in Manchester, England, lived a great deal of my life there till I was 22, 23, except for the war years when we were evacuated to Buxton in the High Peak district. Well, I was born and brought up in a Jewish family. I felt very connected with my Jewish identity. When I was fortunate enough, unusually for that era, that I got into University of Manchester. My parents wouldn't let me go further, and there I did a pre-social work preparatory degree. Went off to Israel, which was then a new and exciting state, full of drama, and there I stayed on beyond the course that I had been sent on in order to do some voluntary work with groups of little boys, young boys. And that prepared me to think that I wanted to work with children and young people. And when I got back to England, I found that I was sent to be a teacher, which I thought was a bit odd because I had no training, but I obviously quite liked it. I must have been reasonably good at it. I became a qualified teacher, worked in a then famous special school in the country outside Manchester. Then I came to London looking for more adolescent type pupils or people to work with, and I found myself offered 3 jobs in Jewish youth clubs, and I went to them all. I was offered them all, but I chose Brady. I chose Brady because when I walked in to the overcrowded and noisy canteen, in order to meet, for some reason, it was the last person I met, the person who would be my mentor and chief insofar as the youth work was concerned, he kept me waiting deliberately, I think, so I should experience the warmth and the humour that was going on during the canteen period. Canteen period was a break between activities, and it appeared to me that hundreds of boys had crowded into this little room, and I didn't realise at the time, but in order to show off to the one young woman in the room, 2 young men advanced towards each other and started to sing a song, which I listened to and I thought was an extremely funny and delightful song called "They're Speaking Hindustani Where the Mamalushan Used to Be," Mamalushan being the Jewish Yiddish dialect, and it was referring to the change in population of the East End that was just about to happen. They got it wrong, talked about Hindustani and blues, which was a strange mixture, but nevertheless it was warm and welcoming to the people who were coming in, and a statement that many of the Jewish families would be moving out after the severe bombing of the East End. And that's where they'd come as refugees, and this is where the next were coming from. To my surprise, it was written by a young boy in the club several years previously. And that warmed me to the club as opposed to the other ones I'd seen, which were very formal and very correct and very rather boring, in fact. But this was far from boring. And in fact, I married him later because he was involved in the club as a grown-up as well as a boy. Ronnie Usiskin, the boy who'd written the song when he was a boy. By the time I married him, he was a grown man and had become a voluntary manager in the club. Went on to become the chair of the club, actually. The person I was waiting for was Yogi Mayer, who had been leader of the boys' club for several years, was very well known, and was about to become the leader of the joint clubs, the Boys and Girls Brady Club, in which he was going to employ me as a youth leader, but for the girls. Not only for the girls, but mainly for the girls. It was all a bit loose, that arrangement, and in addition, I was required to take over from Miriam Moses, OBE, who was about to retire very reluctantly, who'd been a great figure in the East End, and she had set up a number of community activities around the club based on the Girls' Club building, and that were sort of dying at that point, but I was expected to revive them, which I didn't really very well. I was very diffident in approaching the job because it was a new area for me, and I didn't quite grasp the history, that it was a very well-known boys' club, and the girls, although they had their own way of running things, were very unpushy, I would say. For example, every year there was a display, an annual display as it was called, which was like a show. Some of the girls were extremely talented. There was a very talented drama group, for example, very talented sports groups. I was not an expert in either sports or drama, and my main interest was in encouraging the girls to join other groups, like, for example, the photography group, like, for example, the chess group, the debating group, which they began to join in for the first time after I came. But I couldn't quite see what value I gave. It seemed to me that I was very low-key compared with Yogi, who was a figure of great charisma and interest. And he was very kind to me. He didn't bully me or shout or overpower me, but my major set of advisors came from the group of voluntary managers who'd been involved with the club for some years, who were mainly not Brady girls. There was one who had graduated from Brady, but the others were all what we used to call West End girls, i.e. not from the West End, but they all had independent jobs. They were all, some of them had university education. They were all very secure in themselves, and they were key, really, in giving the girls a sense of purpose and a sense of maturity, which took some time to grow. And I think that was the major task of those few years, because until that time, the girls had been considered the girlfriends of the boys. Until that time, the boys had gone over from one club to the other, just round the corner, for the dance. And they had girlfriends, and they walked them home or took them for fish and chips. That was the way things were. They often ended up marrying them, not always, of course. And there were interesting little love affairs going on, but generally there was warmth between them, which over the 2 years I was closely involved grew into a more respectful warmth between the two. And the girls became more key to the development of the club. I didn't really notice it at first because as I was unused to the whole thing, I hadn't really noticed to what extent the girls who, when left to themselves, seemed quite strong and forthright, quietened down when the boys were there. So if they had a meeting about something, it was the boys' voices that were heard. For example, as far as the skeet weekend was concerned, if there was a mixed weekend, it was the boys that decided what the sort of programme would be. And only gradually did the girls take a much more leading part and became much more respected by the boys. And I don't know, I don't think I did anything to help that, except perhaps, as Yogi said to me kindly when I said, I don't know what good I'm doing here, he said, the mere fact that you're here with a university degree and already a bit of a career gives the girls the feeling that they can move. And indeed, many more of them stayed on at school as the years went by. Well, first of all, it was respectful, or it appeared to be respectful. I mean, I was not aware of anything going on that shouldn't have been going on. There was one big a talking point when I came in, which rather amused me, was that one of the girls, you may well meet actually, at the time had a boyfriend who was a local boy but not Jewish. The club's policy was it was for Jewish boys and girls unless there was somebody who was part of a group and they came together as a group. And this boy was one of them. Very nice guy, and she was a very nice girl. And of course it wasn't serious, for goodness sake. They were 16 or 17, and coming from the outside, I could see that. But other people, some of the voluntary managers, were very upset, as I believe possibly her parents were upset, I don't know. But the affair gradually softened over the year, and that was the end of that. In the meantime, the girls were improving with their netball and various other things. They began to play cricket. They began to do much more physical activity than they had before. They were also, of course, we're talking about the end of the 1950s, they were into music. A group of them went off to see the Beatles, I remember, and had their photograph taken, which I think is in the photograph collection. Alma Cogan, she was very well known. She came to the club. They had, in the evening, they had very extensive concern about what should be played and what should be sung, in which I took absolutely no part whatsoever, but encouraged the girls and the boys, it was more girls than boys, I think, to actually organise it. So I think they learnt a great deal from the fact that they were encouraged to get on with things themselves. Of course, they were 14, 15, 16-year-olds. They weren't foolish. I think it was already successful when I came in, and that's mainly owing to Joyce Campbell and her group, who were a modest group of young women with interests all over the place. They'd travelled, they'd studied, and they thought it was a bit of a laugh to come to the club 2 or 3 evenings a week. And afterwards, of course, to go out for coffee with the young men managers. Several marriages eventuated from that, including my own, which caused a great sensation, of course. And I noticed that the top of the club, the captains, vice captains, and those on committees were getting more responsible, I would say. And Yogi encouraged them, but generally he was a ruler, and what he said went, much as Miriam Moses had been in her time. She was a very dominant personality, and fortunately, she was very prejudiced against me, but fortunately she discovered that she knew one of my relatives living in London who she admired, and all of a sudden she changed. Well, she felt that young women shouldn't really be educated to that extent. She was jealous that she had not been, because she was an extremely clever woman, and in another era would have been famous for a lot of things, I'm quite sure. She was very responsible. She could have run big businesses or big concerns, and obviously found it somewhat frustrating to defer to a committee which was called the board, which was a very powerful group of businessmen, and the chair was the person who was then chair of the London County Council. Mrs. Norman Bentwich was the chair of Brady and London County Council. I don't think so. I think my role was quite incidental. I was waiting and watching, basically, and what fascinated me was when I began secretly going out with Ronnie Usiskin. He was telling me what happens in the boys' club, because he'd been in it since he was a young boy, and he had loads of friends, of course, in the girls' club. But the history fascinated me, the change in the East End of London, and the change amongst the boys and girls who I began to meet now, who were much more certain of themselves in the world of London than I think their predecessors had been. Of course, they'd been in the army, or the Ronnie's case was the Air Force, and that made a huge difference. They felt much more secure. Brady was central to our relationship, because I used to be there every evening and he began to come in every evening, which of course managers could. He was one of a group of 4 young men actually, who ran what was called music and display elements that they put on once a year, but prepared for all the time, and occasionally did extra little bits in the canteen just to amuse everybody. the Boys Club Managers Committee was like a club, like a West End gentlemen's club. It was very formal. They wore collar and tie to go to meetings. They took themselves extremely seriously with minutes and everything the way that it would be done in a proper club. The girls were somewhat less formal, as was the girls' club managers. It was much more gentle and informal. But when push came to shove, the rules were the rules. For example, the first time I really got into difficulties, she was one of a large family in the club, well known. She had a boyfriend, and they went regularly to skeet weekends. But Yogi had made a rule that they couldn't go to the weekend of a week in which they had not gone to 2 activities during the week, for which at the time I was required to set somebody up to make a note. Who was doing what? I did not like this at all. It seemed to be contrary to the general friendliness and gentleness of the way the club was run. It seemed to me if you didn't feel like going, provided you apologised correctly, turn up at the club and go to the canteen. But Yogi was very strict. He and I disagreed about this, and he was the boss, so he won. And on one occasion, she did not go to 2 activities a week, and he told me I had to tell her she couldn't go to the weekend. Well, there was a riot. Not a real riot, but her brothers and sisters, one of whom I can remember had left the club, a girl, I still see her, and she still remembers, came and tried to dissuade me, and I said, I can't help myself, you're the club leader, you decide, not Yogi. But eventually I went to him and tried to persuade him, and he wouldn't be persuaded. And then the family went to see him, and they persuaded him. Damn it. And at the last minute, I was thrown. I really, really had it against him for a long time afterwards. But he's a very powerful figure, and he sort of turned it into a joke. However, it's been rather public, so I was upset. And that's one of the things in which the girls' managers would have supported me, I think. Well, in later years, I became a manager and worked with Joyce, who I very much admired, and the other managers. They were all voluntary and very generously voluntary. They used to spend weekends. They left their friends and their family and they went off to skeet. They stayed late at weekends, at evenings in the club. But they did enjoy seeing the development of the girls, because it was an interesting time. It really was an interesting time, which we only realised as the years went by. And of course, after me, they had several professional youth leaders. I can't quite understand what could be done to revive youth groups unless it would be something of the sort that I began to describe to you before, of voluntary groups of kids doing something for other people and doing it in an informal setting where there are some older people to advise them, but things are so difficult now with worry about privacy and about how much you can reveal and to what extent you can intervene in another person's life, even if it's for their own good. The example I gave you before of young people doing voluntary work, I don't think it could be done to that extent today. Not young people of 16. To give them that responsibility, I think, would be difficult, and yet they're well able to take it, and they grow with it. The Brady group became responsible, although they were the voluntary managers there, and although they were the paid club leaders, nevertheless they felt responsible for making sure the doors were open and shut and the lights were off and on. It would never have occurred to them to give all that over to somebody else. And that echoes itself today when these elderly people are remembering their youth and everything they did. I can't see what can replace them. That's the tragedy. I mean, there are attempts in schools and colleges to put responsibility on the shoulders of youngsters, but the background doesn't quite exist, does it? I look at my own grandchildren who are now all in their 20s or 30s, and they do seem to be responsible youngsters, but I think that's because of their family training only. And there are many, 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 as we know, many people, rich and poor throughout the country, who can't give that to their children. My own parents didn't give it to me. They were the parents, I was the kid. That was it. I hope I've given it to my children. I'm not quite sure how I did.